There it goes.
All right. And I actually have a pointer, a laser pointer, that you have to start like an old Chevy with a key.
I guess they push it downhill.
There we go. Hey, look at that. There we go. We are going to be looking at Bethlehem tonight. Bethlehem is, as you know, the hometown of David. When you hear people talk about the city of David, you're talking about the Ophel and that peninsula that just goes south of the Temple Mount that is bordered by the Kidron Valley, the Tyropoeon Valley, the Hinnom Valley, and that is in Jerusalem. That is known as the city of David. But Bethlehem is his town too. It's the hometown of David. It's also the birthplace of Jesus. And Bethlehem has a tremendous biblical history. The earliest reference in the Bible to Bethlehem is in Genesis. And in Genesis 35, Rachel is dying. And as you know, having children was a difficult thing for her. And as she's giving birth for the very last time, she's also breathing for the very last time. And as she breathed her last, for she was dying, beginning with verse 18, she named her son Ben-Oni, which means in Hebrew the son of my affliction, or the son of my pain. But his father named him Benjamin. So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath. You see it also referenced in places like Micah chapter 5 as Ephrathah, and then the parenthetical statement, because that was the original name of Bethlehem that we're talking about, modern Bethlehem, meaning the Bethlehem of like 3,500 years ago. Over her tomb, Jacob set up a pillar, and to this day, that pillar marks Rachel's tomb. You also find it in Ruth chapter 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, so a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The wife is the famous Naomi. The 2 sons, as you know, married Moabite women. One of the sons married a Moabite woman by the name of Ruth. And as you know, all of the husbands died. The one Moabite daughter-in-law decides to stay in country, but Ruth decides to go with Naomi back to Bethlehem. And we read in verse 22, so Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. And as you remember, that's where she meets a fellow by the name of Obed, and Obed and Ruth become part of the genealogy of David, which becomes the genealogy of Jesus. In 1 Samuel chapter 16, the Lord says to Samuel, how long are you going to mourn for Saul? Saul had some kind of a spiritual, emotional breakdown, assumed the position of a priest in presiding over sacrifice. And so Saul is going to be rejected. And Lord says to Samuel, I'm going to find someone who is after my own heart. And he finally goes to Samuel, who is, priest and prophet, and says, how long will you mourn for Saul, since I've rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil, be on your way. I'm sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king. And so he, the story. He goes to Bethlehem. He finds Jesse. Jesse has a bunch of sons. They parade the sons out in front of Samuel. The first one's the tall, good-looking one, and he looks like the guy that would step into the shoes of Saul, who was the tallest man in Israel. And God says no. God looks on the inside while man looks on the outside, and they parade the rest of the sons, and none of them are. They're going to be the one anointed by Samuel to be king. And finally, Jesse sort of remembers that there's this youngest son that is out in the hills south of Bethlehem with the sheep in the hill country. And, because he's the youngest, he is not going to be the one that the father is going to be putting most of his energy and attention on. That's going to be the oldest son, who is going to get the double portion and be really the patriarch that follows in his father's footsteps. But they send for David. And because we're told that David was of ruddy complexion. A lot of people through the years have thought that David was red-headed. I don't think ruddy complexion means that at all. I've been red-headed, and I don't know if I was ever ruddy complected. But they bring him in, and it turns out that the youngest son, who's given the most menial of all jobs, and that's taking care of sheep, is going to be the king of Israel, and Bethlehem is his hometown. In Micah chapter 5, you have this prophecy, but you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel. And so here's kind of this reference to the insignificant nature of Bethlehem. Nazareth, you remember Nazareth, can anything good come from Nazareth? And Nazareth was not the only town in Jesus' life that didn't have a whole lot of significance. Here, Micah, some 600 years, 700 years before the birth of Jesus, is Bethlehem is referred to, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be a ruler over Israel, whose origins are from ancient times. And it is this very passage that we're going to read about here in the next couple of minutes, that is used by the wise men of Israel to tell Herod where the king that the wise men are asking about, where he is going to be born. In Luke chapter 2, as we get into the New Testament, the third of the synoptic gospels, Matthew and Luke are the ones that have the most blown out details, even though they're very scant, of the birth of Jesus. And so beginning in Luke chapter 2, in those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. It was going to be quite a census. And it was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. And everyone went up to their own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth. You'll remember that Jerusalem is the center of the country because it's the capital and it sits on top of a mountain. So even if you're in the north and you're coming to the south, you're still going up because you're going up to the city of God, the city on Mount Moriah, Mount Zion, and that is where Bethlehem is located as well. And so everyone goes up. And Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and the line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. In Matthew chapter 2, Jesus is born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, and Magi from the east came to Jerusalem. The significance, Matthew has kind of the negative stories. Matthew has, King Herod being upset. He has, the Magi leaving, and Herod in his rage and in his paranoia deciding that all of the 2-year-old boys and under in the vicinity of Bethlehem are going to be killed. But here are these Magi that have followed the star to Jerusalem and come to King Herod. They say, where's the one that is born King of the Jews? King Herod is the King of the Jews. And so he's a little put off that a new king has been born, and these wise men have come all the way from the east to worship him because of this star. So King Herod goes back to his own wise men, his own Old Testament scholars. They read to him that Micah chapter 5 verse 2 indicates that the king that is coming from antiquity is going to be born in Bethlehem. It tells you a little bit about King Herod, who has some semblance of knowledge of God, right? He's not completely 100% Jewish. He is, part of his bloodline comes from Idumea or Edom, but he does have this knowledge of God. And here his own wise men say, oh yeah, God has prophesied this king, and Herod is going to try and kill him. And that's what happens. King Herod, when the Magi, and maybe that's the next verse, yes, or the next slide, when Herod realizes that he's been outwitted by the Magi, he becomes furious. He gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time that he had learned from the Magi. And this is one of the truly, it's just not a sad moment in the Bible, but you think about the weeping and the wailing, the quoting of Jeremiah, Rachel, crying for her children because they are no more. This is truly one of the sad moments in the history of the world. And in the churches that we're going to be looking at in just a minute, there's going to be a chapel of the Innocents, which commemorates the fact that there were all of these boys that were murdered at the time that Jesus was being born by a maniacal and paranoid King Herod. And the Magi that come to Jerusalem are going to play a significant part in the history of the Church of the Nativity, centuries down the road. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. In Luke chapter 2, where Matthew is talking about the murder of the innocents and, the crazy-headedness of Herod, Luke is talking about angels and shepherds. And out in the field of the shepherds, the fields of sheep that were between Bethlehem and Jerusalem and in that vicinity, it's at night, the shepherds are there by the fire exchanging stories and keeping each other awake. When an angel appears, scares them to death, talks about the birth of Jesus, and then all of a sudden these myriads of angels show up and they're praising God. And then when they disappear, verse 15, and have gone into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, let's go to Bethlehem and see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has told us about. And there is this tremendous history beginning with Jacob and Rachel. Even going into Joshua, there is this fellow by the name of Ibzan who was from Bethlehem. Some think that maybe it was a Bethlehem that was located in the land of Zebulun, which would put it about 6 or 7 miles north of Nazareth, northwest of Nazareth. But most people go, no, that most of the scholars say no. All the references to Bethlehem, that especially that you see Bethlehem, Judah, or Bethlehem, Ephrathah, that is referring to the one that is near Jerusalem. And this city has a tremendous history that even goes beyond the Bible. Bethlehem was located, as you can see, just south. Here it's referenced as Bethlehem, Judah. That space right there is only about 5.5, nearly 6 miles. It's about 9 kilometers to the south. It's in the hill country. Lots of sheep, lots of shepherd. The area of Moab, you'll remember that in the story of Ruth. Ruth's father-in-law and mother and the 2 sons travel because of the famine into the land of Moab. They take wives. All of the sons die. The father dies. We have 3 widows. One decides to stay in the land. The other Moabite widow goes back into Bethlehem and into this area that where David is going to be born later on, and later on the Messiah. The name Bethlehem, pronounced Beit Lechem, means house of bread. In Arabic, it's Beit Lam. And there's been some debate. It's not really much debated these days, but throughout the study of the Bible through the centuries, people have tried to figure out what Beit Lechem meant. Some have conjectured that it really is not the Hebrew word for bread, but it is a word borrowed from the Philistine language, that is the house of the god Lachum. And but that's been rejected because there's no evidence that any worship or knowledge of that Philistine god has made it that far west into as somebody that was worshipped during that time. There was a time that Bethlehem was taken by the Philistines. You'll remember there was this one day where David is kind of sighing and wished that he had some water from the well that was really famous in Bethlehem, and 3 of his mighty men fight their way into Bethlehem, get the water, and take it back to him. So the Philistines were there, but there was no evidence of this particular Philistine god ever being worshipped in that area. Another theory was that Bethlehem meant the place of fighting, and it certainly was a place of fighting. But today, probably 100% across the board, most people write and that Bethlehem means the house of bread. Bethlehem suffered at the hands of Hadrian in the 2nd century, one of the Roman emperors, who had all of the Jewish people expelled from it. So anything that the Messianic Jews, the Christian Jews, and even the Jews who were there and familiar with the sites that would involve the Old Testament and King David, all of that there would have been some retained knowledge about that. But Hadrian in the 2nd century had all of the Jews expelled. So basically the knowledge of all of those sites were done away with. They just disappeared. And the sites in Bethlehem that we look at, very dubious that is actually the site that is being commemorated. The upside is that Bethlehem is such a small place. So if you're not at the right place, you're maybe only about 500 yards or 1,000 yards from the right place. And so my guess is these places are the wrong place. There was nothing in terms of the churches signifying that these were holy places that was scientific or researched out. It was basically in the 4th century, Queen Helena, who was the mother of Constantine, she wanted to take a trek to the Holy Land. If she asked if this is the place, nobody was going to tell the Queen Mother that it wasn't. And so when she gets to Bethlehem, she sees these caves. She goes, "Is this where Jesus was born?" They say, "Absolutely, Queen Mother." And then Constantine begins to build a church. But the reason that these places were lost in Bethlehem is because the Jews were expelled from it in the 2nd century. The tradition that Jesus was born in a cave dates back to the 2nd century when it was first mentioned by Justin Martyr, one of the church fathers. Like with a lot of translation work, there was trying to understand how words were to be translated, not in light of present history, but in ancient history, sometimes had presented itself an issue. And so the story that I grew up with, and probably most of us grew up with, is that Joseph and Mary are coming from Nazareth to Bethlehem. It's the largest census in the entire Roman world. It's during the time of Quirinius and Caesar Augustus. And because Joseph and Mary are coming from such a large distance, all of the other relatives who were living closer to Bethlehem and maybe living in Jerusalem, they got to the house first. And so this word kataluma was translated as inn because, there were hotels and inns, not knowing that Jewish people were discouraged from staying at an inn. An inn was a very unsavory place. It was, you just did not hang out there. When we ran into this when our first long road trip in Brazil back in the late 80s. We were driving from the capital to the coast, and on the way back, it was a 2-day trip, and we had only been in country about 6 months, and we trying to figure out how things were done was, we were still in that learning curve, and we had driven and driven and driven and driven. We got lost in the town of Campinas for about an hour, finally made our way out, but by that time we were so tired because we'd been driving all day that we were going to try to find a hotel. Well, in Brazil, a hotel is fine. Hotel is where people stay, but a motel, that's a trysting place. And so here the two missionaries and their wives and little baby daughter are driving up to this motel out in the middle of nowhere, and they would not allow us to stay there. They wouldn't even open the gate for us to come in. They did not want these these Americans staying in this place of ill repute. And we had no clue until we got back to Brasilia and we were telling the story. Yeah, we were going to stay at a motel, and we got stopped, and the Brazilians' eyes were just huge. And they said, "You were going to stay in a motel? Do you know what happens in a motel? Nobody stays in a motel. If you just stayed in a motel, you couldn't be a missionary anymore." It was nuts. And the same thing was true during the time of Jesus. The word kataluma means guest room. And so, it was translated as an inn, but anybody knowing the history of the first century, it was not an inn, it was a literal guest room. There's no way a Jewish couple, an Orthodox Jewish couple, especially an Orthodox, super traditional conservative family from Nazareth, would stay at an inn. So what happened is, because Bethlehem is a town full of caves, a village full of caves, the relatives who were closer got there first. So it tells you a little bit about the family of Joseph. Here's his pregnant wife, and they go, no, we got in this bed first. You guys have to go elsewhere, even if she is going to have a baby. So they end up having to go into the cave that in Bethlehem, houses would have been built over a cave. The cave would have served as a barn. And with the animals, the livestock down below, the heat would have come up on cold evenings and would have heated the house upstairs. But the guest room, the room that was set aside in the house that they were going to, was full of relatives, and so they ended up having to go into that area below in the cave. This is why Justin Martyr said it was probably in a cave. I agree with him, having been there. That is a city of village of caves, and that's probably where Jesus was born. Was in this cave rather than a traditional barn, and it was because the guest room in the house already had 100 relatives in it, and there was no room in the guest room. It wasn't because it was an inn that had no occupancy out front, no vacancy out front on the sign. In 329, Constantine erects a basilica with an octagonal chapel over a series of caves. His mother, Queen Helena, dedicated the Church of the Nativity on May 31st, 339. It took about 10 years for it to be built and for her to make it back down there. And 10 years later, she is dedicating what is on the site today as the Church of the Nativity, even though the original one was destroyed. Justinian I, who would have come, some 200 years later after the church was destroyed, built a newer, larger church. He altered the plan, and some modifications have been made through the years, but the present structure basically represents what Justinian was doing and still captures some of that original basilica that Constantine built beginning in 329 AD. The original mosaic floor of the church can still be seen. We're going to show you a picture of the floor of this church where the rocks have been lifted up, and you can see the original Constantinian floor, that mosaic. And because it's been covered up, the colors on it are very, very vibrant. It hasn't been walked on for a long time. It's not been exposed to the sun that has faded it. So it's an absolutely gorgeous floor that can be seen under the floor of the present Church of the Nativity. The Church of the Nativity, and this is where the Magi come in again. The Church of the Nativity is the one church not destroyed during the Persian invasion of the early 7th century. There was a mosaic of the three wise men who very obviously were dressed as Persians, or at least looked like they came from the east. And the general of the army saw that and decided to save the church because there was some connection with that church and his people in history. And so the mosaic of the Magi kept the Church of the Nativity being destroyed. In 1099, the Crusaders are going to recapture Bethlehem during the Crusades. They did a lot of restoration work on this church, and one of the significant things that you experience even today is the entrance to the church is through a doorway which was reduced in height during the Crusades to keep people from riding into the church on horseback. And so again, the walls around the Temple Mount, all of this, they are putting these stones back together after they have been torn down. They're putting the wall, the Muslims and the Christian church. And, they didn't want people riding into the church on horseback. So they made the door so small that you really kind of have to bend down a little bit to go into it. But they didn't want, the enemy with horses coming in and running over the soldiers who might have barricaded themselves in the church. The horses would run over people. That's why they were armored as well, not just to keep them from being wounded, but actually to inflict harm as well. From the vantage point of being on top of a horse, you're striking down rather than striking up. So the Crusaders decided, if this is going to be the last ditch area for the battle, we're going to make sure that it's going to be mano a mano, and it's not going to be, a bunch of guys, filling up this church on horseback and trampling us down and defeating us that way. And how many of you have read Max Lucado's book? Is actually his third, written in, I believe, it's the early 90s, called God Came Near. Does that ring a bell? There is, he writes these little 2 or 3 page devotionals, and in that he talks about when he went to Israel in the early 90s, and the significance to him spiritually of having to bow down as he goes into the church that commemorates the birth of the King, the Messiah, the Lord incarnate, Jesus of Nazareth, and being born in Bethlehem. And I had read the book, and that was one of the things that struck me when I ended up a few years later going to Israel and walking through that same door and being reminded, that was not the reason that door was lowered in height. It wasn't, for us to pay homage and to bow before the King who was born in Bethlehem, but it was to keep the enemy out from trampling people down. There are 3 fields around Bethlehem. They are known as the Shepherd's Fields. 2 are owned by churches. The 3rd is privately owned. And what you find out in these hills is you find a lot of sheep pen that have been built by rock. So much easier, instead of chopping down trees that are nearly non-existent in these hills, it's much easier to pile up rocks and to form these sheep pens with a little entryway that the shepherd would lay across, and for the sheep to stay in there at night and be protected from predators. Jerome moved to Bethlehem in 384 AD. Some 50 years, nearly 50 years after the church of the Nativity had been dedicated. And he actually lived for 36 years in one of those caves. Remember that there was a series of caves. Helena said, "Is this where it happened?" They say, "Yes." So this church is built over these caves, this set of caves, saying that this is the place where Jesus was born. So the great church father, Jerome, moves to Bethlehem in 384, been in Jerusalem, and for 36 years, he's living underneath the Church of the Nativity in one of these caves, and this is where the Latin Bible, known as the Vulgate, was translated. The Vulgate, that's Latin, it means to make common. And the Catholic Church still uses the Vulgate as sort of the basis for its scripture and doctrine. And interestingly enough, Martin Luther, who is an Augustinian monk, Catholic, because there was nothing else at the time, it's pre-Reformation, he is in Germany. He is teaching. Just a couple of years before he begins teaching in Wittenberg, Germany, a guy by the name of Erasmus, probably the smartest man on the planet at that time, puts together the very first Greek New Testament. It gets into the hands of Luther, who begins to read it and begins to see that there is a huge difference between the Bible in the New Testament, I should say, in its original Greek. There's a lot of difference between it and what Jerome had translated into Latin. And as you know, October 31st, 1517, Luther has had enough of this false gospel. And the indulgences that were being sold and all of that. He nails the 95 Thesis on the Wittenberg Castle, and the Reformation is started. Well, the Reformation is a battle of doctrine. Where do you get your doctrine, and what does the Bible say? Because Luther is arguing from original texts, at least the texts that were known in 1517. There have just been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds that have been found since then, including the Dead Sea Scrolls and things like that. He is arguing against the doctrine of the Catholic Church, which is based on Jerome's translation of the Latin. It's known as the Vulgate. And so the Catholic Church at this time is never going to accept what Luther is saying as the Bible in order to protect their doctrine. And so the Catholic Church still uses the Vulgate, the Latin, as sort of the basis for a lot of its doctrine. The more Protestant translations of the Bible, beginning in 1517 and with Luther and, the work of Calvin and Zwingli and later on Tyndale and people like that, based more on the Greek language. And so that explains why there was so much difference in the doctrine between the Protestant Reformation movement and the Catholic Church as it was at that time. Again, Catholic doctrine has been amended and amended over the centuries, but that Bible that the Catholics use, that plays such an important part of the Reformation, was actually translated and put together in Bethlehem in one of the caves thought to be the birthplace of Jesus. All of that, by the way, is for free. You don't have to pay for it. The Roman Catholic Church is known as the Church of St. Catherine. We'll show a picture of that in just a second. Here are the pictures. As you go into this little village of very few people during the time of Jesus, it has grown into a really big city. I don't know what the population is, but I'm going to guess it's probably close to 1 million people. As you can see, everything's made out of stone. The streets are man, they are some kind of tiny, and nobody drives big trucks or Cadillacs or anything like that through these streets. They're usually little cars. Some of them are extremely nice little cars, but they're little cars. You can see, the streets are so narrow. You don't want to be driving anything that you're going to have to put up on a sidewalk to get around. And the people density of these cities are tremendous. I think Bexar County, San Antonio, our people density is about 12 people per square mile. Our people density is ridiculous compared to places like Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, Tokyo, Mexico City, New York City, where all of the living structures go straight up in the air. Ellen and I were two people. We live in a house that's nearly 2,200 square feet. In the Middle East and in most places around the world, and especially in the time of Jesus, two people sharing that much space is that is ludicrous. When you got that much space, you're going to have a big family in there. 2,200 square feet, that's enough for about 20 people, to share a house. So, there's probably on some of these streets, there's not enough room on the streets for all of the people to get down onto the street at once if they had to. But this is modern Bethlehem today. Everything made out of stone, very typical Palestinian city. Bethlehem is occupied territory. There's a checkpoint that you have to go through. People have been shot and killed in front of the gates going into Bethlehem with at least perceived acts of terrorism. Sometimes very much acts of violence. One time we were going into Bethlehem, and it was in the late 90s, and there was a lot of people on our little bus. We were a crew of about probably 30 people on our bus and other buses like ours, and the guards were coming up to the buses and saying something, and they got to our bus and they said, "Hey, there's really no problem here, but it would be a lot easier on everyone if you guys went away for about an hour. We just got word that CNN and the BBC and all of these news agencies are about to show up, and when the cameras start rolling, then things get dicey around here." So sure enough, we were turning our bus around to leave. We were going to go someplace else for a couple of hours and come back later in the day. And as we were leaving, the cameras were being set up, and here were these little kids that were playing soccer. And they put on their scarves and started throwing rocks at nothing. But they were being photographed by these international journalists, and it looked like these kids were throwing rocks in the streets, and liberation fighters and all of that kind of stuff. And we were sitting there as we were driving by, and I had a picture at one time, and it's on an old computer hard disk somewhere, but it was a picture of these kids throwing rocks at nothing, which always adds to the paranoia of traveling in the Middle East, when Israel really is one of the safest places in the world. Here is the Church of the Nativity, and as you can see, lots of stones, lots of rocks. You can tell by the size of the rocks. There was a lot of amending to the walls and rebuilding of the walls. These stones right here that were more of the base, they're probably more original than the stones at the top, which are much smaller. This is the entrance that we were talking about, where the main entrance, the height of the main entrance into this church was lowered to keep the horses from getting into it. And as you can see, here's the original. And then the Crusaders came in and filled all of this. They laid a lintel and the post. And I'm 5'7". I don't have to bend down to go in there, but other people do. But as you can see, everything is rock. Going back, this area right here is known as Manger Market, or excuse me, Manger Square. You remember that chain across that? And somebody from our group walked into it. Yeah. This is the plan of the Church of the Nativity. That door, the small door, is right in here. You walk in. There are 4 sets of columns in this rectangular shaped basilica. The open places in the floor where the stones have been pulled up, where you can see the original mosaic floors, are going to be right in here. Now, this area right here is this area right here is closed off. This right here looks like a big holy room with all kinds of hanging lights and that, but you don't really see the door, the floor plan right here. The octagonal chapel would have been situated right here, 8-sided chapel. But what they're trying to show you is how this church was built on a series of caves. The grotto, or the cave of the Nativity, is this right here. And there's, the cave extends, and there's passageways, and there's caves all through here. And, the church was literally built on top of the caves that the Queen Mother Helena, the mother of Constantine, who's the Emperor of Rome, was told, yeah, this is the place where Jesus was born. Highly unlikely, but that's the story. To get into it, this place right here is holy. You have to be a priest to enter into that, and there'll be some pictures so you can kind of see it's very ornate. And this area right here is closed off. I don't have a clue as to what's in it, but these right here are semicircular stairs that go down underneath this holy spot, where you enter into the caves underneath the Church of the Nativity. And there is the place where it's a marble slab that has a silver star that with many points on it. It doesn't look like a typical star. It's a magic star that God created to lead the Magi. So it's a multi-pointed silver star with a piece of glass in the middle of it that you look down into the grotto of the Nativity as you're walking around down there. And you can enter from this side, and you can enter from that side down into that grotto area. Here is the little door, and here are the places where the stones have been lifted up, and you can see the original mosaic floor. It's it is an ancient church. This church is one of those places where when you go into it, it is heavy with the smell of incense. And look at the columns. The columns. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of smoke from these urns. That incense being burned, and celebrations and candles and all of that. You can see what is remaining of a mosaic from hundreds of years ago. And here's another picture looking from the door end of the basilica. Here is the open area for worshipers. Here's the place where it's been opened, where you see the original floors. And right here is that holy area. As you can see, it's lifted up, which is a sign that for lay people like myself and others, typical tourists, we don't want to profane that. They don't want us to profane it in their eyes. So it's lifted up, and there's a barrier there to keep you from going up in it. When we were there in 2016, I think it was the Armenians, their priests were up here in this area going through their chants and the burning of incense and candles and all that, and doing their chants, and we got to see that as we were walking through. There are all of these tourists walking by, but these guys are focused on what they're doing, and and you're trying to be respectful. You don't want to be disrespectful to these men of faith, and so you don't talk except in a whisper. And to go to those semicircle stairs to go down underneath this area, this holy area here, to the grotto of the Nativity, you go on this side around this column, or this column right here, and that's where you run into those semicircular stairs that will take you down underneath. Here is the mosaic that is under the floor. As you can see, it's very vibrant in color. That comes from being covered up and protected from people walking on it in sunlight and, the stones fading away. A lot of geometric shapes. Absolutely a gorgeous piece of artwork from antiquity. Here's another picture. I mean, you see all the little stones in it. And, somebody was down on their hands and knees with a floor plan and with color codes and, stacks of little rocks and mortar and painstakingly, put this mosaic together that goes back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Here are the semicircular stairs. That closed-in holy place is on the other side of this wall, and the icons and the holy pictures. Here's that column that I was pointing to with the pointer that you go around, and when you go through there, you're actually going into the area where the cave is that commemorates the birth of Jesus, and that's the star. And you look down into that thing. There's no lights. There's no. I mean, did you see anything? I didn't see, you look down there and you're looking into a dark cave. And as you can see, very ornate with the three religions that there are three different Christian religious groups. The Catholics, the Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, and the Armenians are the ones that take care of this particular spot. And their three churches kind of converge on the chapel there in the church in the Nativity. But that's supposed to be the star that sent the Magi on their way to Bethlehem, and it was this doesn't look like a typical star. It's a special star, and that star is beautiful. But you look through it down into, and that's the cave that the Queen Mother asked, "Is this where Jesus was born?" And she was told, "Yes, it is." This is underneath the Church of St. Catherine, which is adjacent to what we were just looking at. This is part of that cave system underneath the Church of the Nativity, and this is where Jerome lived. I mean, he came out for sunlight, but this is where he lived. He lived in one of these caves when he was translating the Latin Bible, the Vulgate. And right here is a little inscription in Latin that is commemorating this as the place where Jerome lived all of those years. So again, this is an X marks the spot. This is the place where Jerome lived, even though he may have thought that he was living in the place of the Nativity and probably wasn't. This is where the Vulgate was translated. Here's the Church of St. Catherine. This area right here is actually what is over the cave that Jerome was living in. You'll remember from the Bible history that in the vicinity of Bethlehem, the 2-year-old boys and under were all killed by Herod's stormtroopers. There is a chapel off to the left here that is the Chapel of the Innocents. The Innocents in reference to those boys that were killed by Herod. But this is the Catholic section of the Church of the Nativity. Everywhere you go in Bethlehem, you run into an olive wood factory or some kind of a store that sells souvenirs. What's kind of cool about this picture is you get to see, we still laugh at times when we think about, there's this olive wood is carved, and because it's Bethlehem, it has to do with nativity scenes. There are when we think of nativity scenes, we think of something that you put on top of your piano. Something that is kind of small, and you can certainly buy those here. The camels and wise men and shepherds and sheep and all that kind of thing. I mean, you make them out of Legos, right? It's the same deal. But they make these gigantic ones, and that is actually not even the largest one we saw. We didn't dare take a picture of the biggest one we saw because it was $60,000, including free shipping, and it was nearly life size. And we thought, man, if we take a picture of this, they're going to make us spend some money on it. And but it was actually in the Nissan Brother gift shop. If you're going to Israel with us in June, this is the gift shop that we will be in while we're in Bethlehem. This gift shop and the factory is adjacent, right close to the Church in the Nativity. So as you're leaving, the Nissan brothers, they are Christian. They are one of the few remaining Christian families in Bethlehem. There has been a lot of pressure to move the Christians out of Bethlehem since it's occupied, and that would make it Muslim territory. But there's been a lot of trying to move them out, and but they're kind of like the Sopranos. They are a tough family, and they have got the biggest market share you can imagine on this stuff. And as you leave the Church in the Nativity, they work it out where you just sort of leave the Church in the Nativity and segue into a tour of Olivewood. And I was going to show you a picture, but didn't stick it in. Olivewood has to cure and dry decades and decades and decades. I seem to remember 70 years. Do you remember?
No, it was a long time.
Yeah. You know, we barely wait a year before we burn a piece of wood in a fireplace to carve something. It's literally decades of time. And so you see the pile of wood that is just sitting there curing and waiting, that we will never see in our lifetime turn into some of this. From there you go into the workshops and the lathes and all of that, where these are actually being made. On the lathes, the chalices or the Holy Grails or the Christ cups or the communion cups from the Last Supper that, that this is what most people believe they look like. They're turned on lathes. You've got guys with pneumatic knives and chisels and things like that are getting these things shaped to go to guys with smaller knives and more fine blades to be able to carve all of this. And you end up then in the gift shop, and lots of stuff to buy, to bring back. And if you want to buy a $60,000 nativity scene, you can do that, and it includes free shipping to the United States. And that is our last slide. And we timed it just right. I think I heard the bell go off. Barry, could you get the lights, please? Thank you so much. And we'll see you on Sunday.